Hello, good evening everyone. This is Dr. Sullivan. I am back with you for another I Care for Your Brain Wednesday night free lecture. The idea is to spread the word about science-based brain health education in a way that validates you out there struggling with any kind of a brain health challenge and empowers you so you know what's going on, how to make sense of your symptoms, and what to do about it. So we try to pick topics that are helpful to specific groups of people or sometimes every single person listening, and that's where tonight's lecture really falls in. If you have a brain, then you should be interested in this topic. We are talking about the connection between heart health and brain health. They are very interchangeable, and they're a topic, a pair that is just starting to get their rightful attention. So what we're going to talk about tonight is that very special connection. We're going to talk specifically about vascular disease, which means diseases of the blood vessels, and how when that disease happens in the blood vessels in the brain, they affect us uniquely. And then, as always, what I really care about is giving you my very best recommendations, so how you take this information and actually apply it to your everyday life to get a brain health benefit. So I always like to start off by asking, why is this topic important? Well, most of us have some type of genetic predisposition to something that can go wrong in the aging process, whether this is dementia, whether this is stroke, whether it's a heart attack that could affect the brain. And what turns on these genes are something in our environment. And these risk factors we're going to talk about today are the most influential risk factors that can turn on the dementia genes. So I don't know about you, but I think we should be talking about these things and really giving you the tools to know, okay, how do I make better decisions that can reduce these risk factors? That's the thing about a lot of these lifestyle risk factors, is it's not that they're either here or they're not. They're here in various degrees, and we're the ones through what we put in our body, what we do with our bodies, how we manage stress, how we manage our medical conditions. We're the ones who have control over whether that risk grows big or whether or not it stays small. We also want to talk about this because many of you who are on Facebook, the age group that it seems to be most successful with are people in their middle ages. So this is anywhere from, let's say 35 all the way to 60. This group is known in the research community for having the strongest connection between these vascular issues and brain health in old age. So in other words, what you are doing now in your 30s and your 40s and your 50s really comes home to roost when you're in your 70s, your 80s, your 90s. And if you don't know what you should be doing, you're potentially going to miss this opportunity to really help your future brain age as well as it possibly can. And maybe the biggest reason is that these are modifiable risk factors. There's things that we can actually do to reduce these risk factors. It's not like luck of the draw. They are what they are. They're really not. But if we don't know what we're looking for and what to manage, then we're kind of out of luck. So when I said at the beginning that this connection between the brain and the heart is relatively new, they only had their first international conference about it in 2012, not that long ago. So this happened in Paris. It was the Heart and Brain Conference. And what they really were motivated by was this idea of how to dramatically reduce the worldwide incidence of dementia. And what the chief of the conference basically said is that if we were to help the public understand the association between cardiovascular health and the increased risk for dementia, that this would be a monumental step forward in reducing the worldwide cases of dementia. And so now every year that this conference has gone on, they're talking about the things we're going to talk about tonight. So the first bit of education we need as we start this topic is to really define what is the vascular system. Well, many of you have probably heard of the cardiovascular system, right? This is, of course, our heart and all of the veins and the arteries and the capillaries that transfer the blood to and from the heart. Once you get above the neck, this actually becomes the cerebrovascular system. It's all interconnected. It just takes on a different name once we actually get into the vasculature of the brain. So what do blood vessels really do? Well, they do a ton of things. It's, of course, the essence of life. It circulates and transports the nutrients that we need, the glucose that our brain needs, the oxygen that our brain needs. It takes away carbon dioxide. It moves hormones throughout the brain. It fights disease. It keeps our temperature stable. It helps us maintain homeostasis. It carries off waste. It basically does many of the biological mechanisms that keep us healthy. When blood vessels are healthy, they are elastic, they can expand and contract to meet the demands of the environment. And this is important because sometimes we do things where we need extra fuel, right? We need more oxygen if we're in a marathon, if we're working on a really, really hard work project. We need more energy to go up to that brain. So our blood vessels actually expand so we can get more of the fuel in there. When they are not able to expand, when they are diseased from different cardiovascular health issues, which is the focus of our talk tonight, they're very stiff and they're not able to change according to the demands in our environment. And this is where we can get into trouble. A big part of this is because brain cells cannot store their energy. They have about a lifespan of anywhere from 4 to 9 minutes. If they don't get enough oxygen and enough glucose during this time, this is when we start to see damage. This is why it's so important that if you think you're having a stroke, you get right to the hospital. If you think you're having a cardiac arrest, if someone is drowning, we know that there's only a few minutes that the brain can really survive without irreversible damage, without its fuel. So once we get into that cerebrovascular system in the brain, I want you to understand exactly what's going on there because it's very relevant to the topic of brain health and everything we're talking about tonight. So many of you know we have our internal carotid arteries that are in the front here. These are about the size of our pointer fingers. Those are right here in the front. And eventually they kind of branch off and meet each other in the middle. We then have our vertebral arteries in the back, which are a little bit more like the size of your pinky. And the carotids in the front and the vertebrals in the back all join together right kind of in the top middle part of our brain, and they form a nice big circle. And that is very helpful because if you have one blocked carotid artery, there is backup system. There is other blood flow to the same part of the brain. Now, that is the good news. The bad news is the whole brain does not get its blood and oxygen this way. There are also very, very small blood vessels in the very middle part of the brain, and their diameter is about the same size as a strand of hair. Okay, so that is pretty tiny. These are like one-way streets. There's no backup systems. Once these become diseased or brittle or fill up with cholesterol, there's really nothing we can do about it, right? We stint the heart, but we haven't developed the technology yet to stint the brain. So once this damage has happened, that's kind of it. And this is where a lot of us, as we age, we can have difficulty with recall, we can have trouble with organizing things at the same level we did before, coming up with information, people's names very quickly, because that middle part of the brain is what really helps us with recall. Also helps us do things like walk and keep our balance. So if we are not careful as we get older, we can have a worsening of the normal aging process simply because we have some vascular disease in these very small blood vessels. So when I talk about vascular risk factors, I want you to understand exactly what those are. Well, the first one is just age. It's just wear and tear. Once we're about 50 years old, unfortunately, we start to get a little bit of problem with our vascular system. Most of us do. The next one is is hypertension. This is high blood pressure. This is the number one thing that you need to understand and control and know about at any point in your life, but especially middle age, that really catches up with you when you're in your 70s and in your 80s. Next one is high cholesterol. Next one is uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. When blood sugar shoots up real high or goes down real low, that causes damage in those blood vessels, and they're just not as flexible, as elastic as they used to be. Sedentary lifestyle, not getting enough physical activity. This is a very important thing. You'll hear this more once I get to the recommendations that keeps your vascular system healthy. Untreated sleep apnea. This causes damage to the blood vessels slowly over time, has a whole bunch of other problems for the brain too, but it really does create problems And it relates back to what I said before. The brain wants continuous blood flow, continuous fuel, continuous oxygen and glucose. And sleep and apnea means you stop breathing. Most people who have sleep apnea stop breathing dozens, if not hundreds of times per night. So every single time, if your oxygen saturation of your blood goes from in the 90s, which is normal, all the way down to very, very low, over time, there is a cumulative damage that happens. And again, it's all, the end effect is all in these blood vessels not being as flexible and as able to expand and contract. Drinking too much alcohol as we get older, smoking, inflammatory diet, what we eat is very important, and then not managing stress properly. That is such an important thing. You know, we often think of, people who work themselves to death having heart attacks, or the statistic that most heart attacks happen on Monday morning on the drive to work. Unmanaged stress really has a very profound impact on the way that how hard our heart pumps, just the intensity of the blood pumping through our veins. I mean, can't you feel that when you're really stressed out? I mean, that's part of that tension headache, is the blood vessels are becoming so small and tight that we just, it's just the blood pressure is not regulated properly. So I want to talk a little bit more about hypertension or blood pressure of all those risk factors, because it is the most powerful, the most influential. So when I talk about hypertension, what this really is the force of the blood against the arteries, the blood vessels that carry the blood away from the heart, okay? So we've all heard of numbers for blood pressure, right? So anything above 130/80 is considered to be too high. Now, they actually changed this recently to 140 no, pardon me, they changed it from, I think it became 140/60. And the idea is that if you have it and you take medication, there's still a little bit of risk because you had it for some time before it was medicated, and the damage is largely irreversible. But what's really the problem is if you don't take that medication consistently, or if you still have episodes of uncontrolled high blood pressure, even if you take medication. So a lot of people will say to me, well, I don't have high blood pressure. And I'll say, yeah, but you take 2 medications for it. And they're like, right, but my blood pressure is well controlled. Well, there's probably, unfortunately, some cumulative effect of the years you had it before it was well treated. Some people don't go to the doctor a lot in their 30s and 40s. Maybe they had high blood pressure for 5, 10, 15, 20 years before they got the medication. Over time, there is micro tears that happen because of that velocity, because of the intensity of the blood that's pumping through the blood vessel. The inside of blood vessels is really meant to be very smooth. Blood should be able to move very freely, but when there's too much pressure, we get these teeny tiny little micro tears. And what happens is little tiny spaces then start to form, and this is where cholesterol, these fatty deposits, can build. Over time, these little tiny soft fat deposits actually become calcified. The brain, the body being so smart, it actually grows a little bit of a hard calcium cap over it to keep it contained to the side of the blood vessel. Otherwise, we would have fatty deposits, cholesterol running all throughout our body. We would all be having strokes all the time. So it basically has to cement it to the side of the blood vessel. Well, that's part of what makes blood vessels harden up and lose their plasticity and lose their ability to do that magical contracting and expanding. So what can happen over time is it's basically a perfect storm for poor brain health. If you have chronic blood pressure issues, high cholesterol, maybe something like untreated sleep apnea, the biggest danger for brain health is when these risk factors come together and they are not well controlled. So over time, if we get these deposits and the blood vessels stop expanding properly, basically we cannot get enough blood and oxygen into the brain cells. And over time, slowly this causes death of certain brain cells. Now, not a ton of death, but this is where we can notice a little bit more cognitive slipping. We're still able to do the things that we always have done, but maybe things are a little bit harder or things take a little bit longer. So the effect of this type of brain damage in the brain really depends on how poorly controlled these risk factors are and where in the brain it happens. So remember before I said there's these teeny tiny little diameter of a hair blood vessels that are in the middle part of the brain called the subcortical area. Well, the smaller something is, the more easy it's going to be to get damaged, right? Think of the carotid arteries. You could literally see them with the naked eye. They're so big, it would take a long time of building up plaque and those blood vessels getting stiff to really have a disease effect. But imagine something as teeny tiny as a little strand of hair. Not too much of a vascular disease does it take to build up to actually show you some problems. So it really depends what blood vessels and how bad off the risk factor has gotten. That determines what the actual impairment is going to be. So sometimes we can have trouble, like we said, sometimes the carotid arteries do get blocked up, right? And so sometimes if that is part of what brings the blood and oxygen to the outer part of the brain, we can see trouble with making memories. We can see trouble with finding our way around, in spatial locations. But most often, because those inner blood vessels are so small and they're so much more susceptible to damage, what we really see is trouble with that recall. So the smallest blood vessels in the whole body are at risk. This is in the brain, like I've been saying, but also in the eyes, in the kidney, and in the feet. So we kind of have this rule in brain health that what happens in the feet, the eyes, and the kidneys is also often happening in the brain, but in a way that's more silent. When you have not enough blood and oxygen to the feet, for example, you get peripheral neuropathy. You get that feeling of fire in your feet. You get numbness and tingling. Your brain gets a message that there is something wrong. When you have poor blood flow in your eyes, you can get all sorts of things, little micro bleeds that you're actually able to perceive. The brain, we're so able to compensate, and it's so subtle sometimes, the changes that happen, that we don't even know it, we're not aware until we do something like a neuropsych evaluation and someone really pushes our cognitive ability through testing, and we're able to actually get some feedback that maybe there is something more than just age happening. So it's very important to get these things evaluated early, because once vascular disease happens, it's really, really, really hard to turn back the test of time. So when we think of vascular disease in the brain, so cerebrovascular brain disease, there's a spectrum, right? There's something all the way from what we call white matter disease, which are those teeny tiny little blood vessels getting clogged up, breaking off, becoming fragile. And when you scan someone, a CT scan or an MRI of the brain, you actually see little white spots in the brain. So we call that white matter disease. There's some controversy whether or not that actually results in real world impairment or not. Really depends on the person, how much what we call cognitive reserve they have, which means how well can they compensate for some mild deficits. Then we have something called vascular cognitive impairment. This means your brain is aging a little bit more than we would expect just for your age, but you are independent in everyday life. You are able to drive. You don't need reminders to take your meds. You don't need someone to help you with your checks and your bill paying. Then the next thing in the spectrum is getting into the world of stroke. The first thing is a TIA, a transient ischemic attack. We sometimes call these mini strokes. These are fleeting neurological symptoms that happen, but they also go away, typically within an hour, and there's no permanent damage that can be seen on a brain scan that is left behind. The next thing that can happen is a stroke, and we talk about strokes a lot here. Ischemic strokes, hemorrhagic strokes, basically an interruption in the blood flow to the brain that results in permanent visible brain damage. After stroke, the kind of the worst thing in the spectrum is vascular dementia. This is when you either have a very big stroke or multiple strokes, and you start to have significant cognitive problems, and you do need that support in everyday life. So let's talk about what you're going to do about it, okay? Because some of that information is pretty startling, and it makes you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm very motivated now. Please tell me what I'm supposed to do. Well, the first thing I recommend is that you really know your numbers. You have to, I say this all the time, really be an advocate for your own brain health care. You should be on top of your blood pressure numbers, right? You should understand exactly, every time you go to the doctor, you should ask for feedback on that, and you want them to talk to you. Is it running a little high? Does there seem to be some variability? I want to understand, do you think I'm pre-hypertensive? Really, really, really pay attention to that. The next thing is to be on top of your cholesterol numbers. Know your LDL, that's the bad kind of cholesterol, your HDL, the good kind. They typically do your triglycerides when you go in just for like a blood test for a physical. Know what those numbers are. There's something called a C-reactive protein. This is the measure of inflammation in your whole body, and it's a really good marker for overall cardiovascular health. You should know that number. I bet your primary care doctor does. And then in the realm of diabetes, you should really know your glucose. If you have diabetes, what is your A1C? You should be charting these things. You should have a notebook, and I want you to be the person who knows the most about these numbers. Yes, your doctor gives them to you, but they have a lot of other yous. You only have you. So they are, on top of these things to various degrees, but you really should be the one that is very aware of these numbers and working hard every day to try to get them more in the healthy range. Something as simple as taking your medication every single day exactly as prescribed is one of those common sense things that not a lot of people do. And there's research to suggest that the more vascular issues you have, meaning if you have high blood pressure, you have high cholesterol, and especially once you add diabetes, that your medication regimen can become so complicated and overwhelming that those are the people that are falling off with taking their meds just like they're supposed to do. So the more you have, the more you actually have to put effort in or ask for some kind of help in doing it. The first step is to just develop a routine, okay? Don't just take them whenever you see the bottles. You have to have what you take in the morning, what you should take at night. Using a pill box is something that we should all do. It's either in there or it's not. You refill it every week. If you have a little memory issue, you no longer have to worry if you've taken it or you haven't. Undertaking medications is problematic, but what's actually the worst, especially for older adults, is forgetting you took a dose and double taking, triple taking. More older adults go to the emergency room for medication overdose than any other single issue. You have to remember every single dose exactly as prescribed. So very risky one way or the other, overtaking or undertaking. I want to encourage you to always use the same pharmacy. One-on-one counseling with a pharmacist has been proven. This was in the New England Healthcare Institute put out a statistic that said one-on-one counseling by a pharmacist is 2 to 3 times more effective in getting you to take your medications just like you should than any other intervention. So pharmacists are very important care partners that are probably pretty underused. So I want you to always go to the same place. They, of course, have all your medications, so they're very good about telling you about interaction effects, telling you maybe one thing that could be aggravating the other. They really are a specialist, a professional to respect and to make sure you're really getting all of the expertise that you possibly can. So about half of the people who have been diagnosed with blood pressure problems do not have the condition under control. And that's why it's so critical. Even if you say, well, I'm taking a medication every single day, it really matters what your numbers are. Investing in a blood pressure cuff for your house is probably a good idea. They're not that expensive. I don't want you to become too obsessed with it. But taking your blood pressure every day is probably a very good health behavior. And then, of course, exercise. Everyone knows this, right? But you might not know how strong the scientific evidence is linking regular physical activity to every measure of cardiovascular health. And what I hope I've convinced you of so far is that cardiovascular health and brain health really go hand in hand. The fuel of the brain, oxygen and glucose, and getting rid of the toxins in the brain, brain cells are constantly changing and reconfiguring their networks. There are byproducts that come from just cells being healthy and happy, and those byproducts have to get out of there. And that's part of what good blood flow helps us to do. And so if we don't have that, we are definitely putting ourselves at risk for less than optimal brain health. So the idea is at least 30 minutes a day of safe aerobic activity most days of the week. And so the idea is you want to just pick something you actually like so you actually follow through and do it. If most Americans were to meet this recommendation, we believe that there would be about a 40% reduction in cardiovascular events. So that is stroke, heart attack. That's pretty significant. That's why when you see that statistic that 80% of strokes are preventable, that's the kind of stuff that they're talking about. So exercise helps the brain in 2 ways. We have direct benefits and we have indirect benefits. So directly, it gets your blood pressure down, gets your bad cholesterol down, increases your good cholesterol, increases your insulin sensitivity, reduces your insulin resistance, gets your inflammation down, helps to improve the body's ability to take in and use oxygen, to get rid of waste and carbon dioxide, helps improve the health of brain cells, helps us actually grow new brain cells in the memory centers of the brain, the hippocampus. And then, of course, indirectly, you are in a better mood after you move your body. You sleep better. You can put things in perspective better. Your coping is improved. It's been shown that our tolerance for pain actually increases when we are more physically active. It can help our self-esteem, reduce fatigue. There's all sorts of wonderful things that exercise can do for us. It's just that discipline to get out there and do it. But remember, any improvement from where you're at now would be helpful for your cardiovascular system and your cerebrovascular system. Then, of course, there is the science of brain food and what do we put into our mouths. This, of course, is the basis for all the nutrients that go into the brain. And what I want you to just think about is less processed foods, more whole foods, reduce the inflammation. That's really key. The things that really inflame the blood vessels, which of course make them come together more and leave less transporting space for the blood to go back and forth to the brain, are things like sugar, especially things like corn syrup, anything that has been through a high-level manufacturing process, oils, palm oils, all that omega-6 stuff, all that junk. That's what you want to try to reduce. So some people just go by the idea of less things in a box or eating nothing from a box, trying to do the periphery of the grocery store and doing the vegetables and, you know, the dairy and even a lot of the grass-fed meats that they're talking about nowadays have been shown to be able to be part of a healthy anti-inflammatory diet. So you want to try to, you know, drink less soda, less fruit juice even, just really good old-fashioned water. Trying to get your vitamins from your food has been shown to be very important. I know a lot of people disagree with me on this one, but this is fine. But there's a lot of research to actually support that people who take vitamins aren't really any healthier than people who don't take vitamins. The only time you really need a supplement is if you've been, in my opinion, is if you've been diagnosed with a vitamin deficiency, vitamin D, vitamin B12, iron, these kind of things. You should supplement with your doctor's support. But I think that a lot of the things that make our brain really happy and healthy can be had from a whole foods diet. Fish oil is maybe the one exception, making sure you get a high quality fish oil if you don't like to eat fish. That definitely has been shown to contribute to a healthy brain. I wanted to also tell you about 3 specific foods to fight hypertension that have been proven in science. So this is not studies that have been put forth by the food industry. This is not put forth by people who have stock in these companies. This is, as far as I know, objective scientific information. The first one is flax seeds, and this has really been shown in women who are postmenopausal to be able to reduce blood pressure naturally. So this was every day eating ground up flax seeds, and in this one study they had people put it into either pasta and sauce in a dinner or to put it over cereal in the morning. The next food is blueberries. There was a study in 2015 that looked at women who were 45 to 65 and they had high blood pressure, and what they did is they had them eat the equivalent of a cup of blueberries every day for 8 weeks, and the women in that group significantly had their blood pressure go down by 5 points, which is actually pretty significant, should make a real world change. And the placebo group didn't have any change at all. Everything else we think about their lifestyle stayed the same. Also, the third one, whole grain, high fiber breakfast cereal. This is thought to get your blood pressure down. If it's in the mild to moderately elevated range, it can get it down by about 20%. That's pretty significant. So what would really be a good idea is to take stock of what you eat for breakfast. That's a great time. Think of what I said, cereal, whole grain, high fiber cereal, blueberries, flax seeds. That's a perfect breakfast right there. So those little tiny changes in your health behaviors can really make a big difference over time. The key is to be manageable, start small. I think if you have too high of expectations about how you're going to change your behavior out of the gate, it's really hard to maintain. One thing that we know in the world of positive psychology is that keeping track of what you're doing now and how you're changing your behavior, through a notebook. We try to put out a lot of things at I Care for Your Brain that are interactive exercises to help you monitor these things, kind of like journals or diaries. And the idea is just keeping track of what you're doing now actually makes you realize, oh wow, look how many sodas I'm drinking a day, or look how many things I ate today that actually came out of a box. Just that act of observing what you're doing now is actually an intervention. That results in behavior change. Then if you start documenting what you're changing, that's very positively reinforcing. We feel better about ourselves when we actually see that we stuck to something. So start small, write it down, have good expectations, but don't think all of a sudden you're going to go out and start running 10 miles every day when you haven't done any kind of intense physical exercise. You could even start with couch exercises. As I'm doing this lecture, you could be reaching your hands up in the sky, marching in your chair, marching on your couch. Any little bit of physical activity more than you did before is a big improvement. So I hope that this information was helpful for you. If there are any groups that you belong to where you think other people would benefit from this information, I would sure appreciate if you were able to share it. Let us know in the comments if you have any specific recommendations that I didn't get to, if there's anything that you've learned that you think would help other people. These are really important pieces of public information that we should all be talking about. We should not be succumbing to the fads and the quick fixes that are out there. All things that are related to brain health really take systematic effort from the person. We're not going to find them, in my opinion, in supplements or in brain games or all of these other things you have to pay for. It's really just knowing what the scientific literature out there tells us that we should do. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next week. I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about. It's been a crazy week around here in the practice, but I'm sure I'll come up with something that will be interesting and helpful. Those are my two goals. So I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.